February 12, 1941. The port of Tripoli, Italian Libya. A German general stepped off a transport plane onto a stretch of tarmac his own high command hadn't wanted him assigned to, sent to rescue an ally that Berlin privately considered a liability. His name was Erwin Rommel. He had no desert experience. He had 2 divisions still loading onto ships back in Naples. And the army he'd been sent to save was, but at that exact moment, one of the most humiliated fighting forces in the world. 10 weeks earlier, on December 9, 1940, a British force roughly a third, the size of the Italian 10th Army in Egypt, had launched an assault called Operation Compass, and simply taken it apart. By early February 1941, Britain had advanced nearly 500 miles, or destroyed or captured the better part of 10 Italian divisions, and taken more than 130,000 Italian prisoners. Some British units reported running out of the fuel and manpower needed to process surrendering soldiers faster than they could round them up. It wasn't a defeat. It was a collapse, and it's the reason Rommel's boots were on that tarmac in Tripoli at all. Hitler sending German troops to prop up a partner whose army had just proven, in the harshest terms possible, that it couldn't hold the line alone. For this is the part of the story most WWII channels skip, because it's uncomfortable and it doesn't flatter anybody. The Afrika Korps didn't arrive in North Africa to fight beside a respected equal. It arrived to rescue a beaten one. For the next 2 years, hundreds of thousands of Italian soldiers, men from Naples and Turin and Sicily, farmers and factory workers who'd been conscripted into a war most of them never wanted, would fight, bleed, and die alongside an ally that, for a long time, barely hid its contempt for them. That's not the whole story, though. It's just where the story has to start if you want the ending to mean anything. Before we go further, if you've been watching this channel, you already know we don't do the sanitized version of this history. We tell you the parts that are uncomfortable right, alongside the parts that are extraordinary, because that's the only way any of it means something real. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and whether anyone in your family served in it. Some of the most important corrections and details on this channel have come directly from families who live this history. Italian, German, British, all of it. Now, back to the desert. Rommel's private assessment of his Italian allies, recorded in his own wartime papers, and later published post-war as the Rommel Papers, was often blunt to the point of cruelty. He complained repeatedly about Italian equipment. Tanks with armor thin enough that British anti-tank rounds went through them like paper. Trucks that broke down faster than they could be repaired. Artillery pieces that were, in some cases, functionally unchanged since the First World War. He was frustrated by an Italian officer corps he viewed as overly cautious, politically appointed, and disconnected from the men they commanded. German staff officers serving alongside Italian units in 1941 and early 1942 wrote reports describing supply chains that routinely broke down, communication failures between Italian and German formations operating in the same sector, and a persistent German assumption, fair or not, that when a position got difficult, the Italian line would go first. That assumption would get tested, repeatedly, over the next 18 months. And it would not hold up the way German command expected it to, because scattered among those beaten, poorly equipped, under-resourced Italian divisions were a handful of units that had trained harder, fought smarter, and would go on to earn something almost no one on the German side expected to give them. Genuine, specific, individually named respect. Not blanket praise for the Italian army as a whole, that never really came, but respect for particular men, particular regiments, particular days in the sand, when a specific group of Italian soldiers did something that made German veterans, men who'd already survived Poland and France, stop and rewrite what they thought they knew about their own ally. The Bersaglieri light infantry, with their distinctive plumed helmets, were about to prove Rommel's own dismissiveness wrong in ways that got carved onto a memorial plaque decades later. The Ariete Armored Division was about to fight to the point of literal annihilation, defending a line the Germans needed held. And a 5,000-man parachute division called the Folgor, trained for an invasion that never happened, was about to make a last stand so costly that only a few hundred of them would walk away from it. a stand that even the British would later call one of the most honourable last defences of the entire North African campaign. June 28 to 29, 1942. The port town of Mersa Matruch, Egypt. 16 months after Rommel landed in Tripoli, assuming he'd been sent to babysit a broken army, a British corps trying to escape encirclement outside Mersa Matruch ran straight into a wall of Italian tanks and guns, and did not get through it easily. By this point in the campaign, Rommel had pushed the British 8th Army out of Gazala, taken Tobruk on June 21 with over 32,000 prisoners, and was now driving hard toward Egypt. On the night of June 28 to 29, a British communications failure left the 10th Corps holding Mersa Matruch with orders to withdraw arriving late. Trying to break out south and east under cover of darkness, British and Indian columns collided with the Italian 133rd Armoured Division Littorio and infantry from the Brescia and Trento divisions. One British column came close enough to Rommel's own command post that his staff officers had to grab weapons and defend it themselves before relocating. The breakout attempt by the 10th Indian Division was repulsed, not by German panzers, but by Littorio's Italian tanks. When the port itself fell on June 29, it was the 7th Bersaglieri Regiment, Italian light infantry recognizable by the distinctive black capercaillie feathers on their helmets, who formally accepted the surrender of roughly 6,000 British Commonwealth troops. Total prisoners taken in the encirclement between Matruch and the follow-up action at Fuka ran past 10,000 men. This is worth sitting with for a second, because it directly contradicts the narrative Rommel himself had been writing in his own dispatches a year earlier. The army he'd arrived to rescue in February 1941. The one that had surrendered 130,000 men in 10 weeks to Operation Compass had, by the summer of 1942, become an army whose armoured division was blocking British breakout attempts and whose infantry regiment was processing thousands of prisoners of its own. It's frequently repeated online, especially on Italian memorial sites and forum threads, that Rommel personally said something like, "The German soldier has astonished the world, but the Italian Bersagliere has astonished the German soldier." A line still inscribed on a plaque honouring the Bersaglieri today. I want to be straight with you about this one, because getting it wrong is exactly the kind of thing that erodes trust in channels like this. Historians who've gone looking for that quote in Rommel's actual wartime papers and correspondence haven't been able to verify he ever said those specific words. It may be real, or it may be a post-war embellishment that got attached to a real man because it felt true, and, honestly, nobody has produced the paper trail either way. What we can verify, from Rommel's own published diaries and after-action reports, is that his tone towards specific Italian units, the Bersaglieri among them, genuinely shifted over 1942, from blanket dismissal to specific, grudging professional respect for particular formations, even while his frustration with Italian high command and Italian logistics never really let up. That distinction matters. Rommel didn't come to respect the Italian army. He came to respect certain Italian soldiers, in certain units, on certain days. The way any professional soldier eventually learns to separate an institution's failures from the individual men inside it, who keep doing their job anyway. And nowhere would that distinction get tested harder than what came next. By late June 1942, Rommel's advance had run out of momentum roughly 60 miles short of Alexandria, at a stretch of desert next to a train station most of the world had never heard of, El Alamein. The First Battle of El Alamein, fought through July 1942, ground to a stalemate. Both sides dug in, resupplied, and prepared for what everyone on the ground understood would be the battle that decided North Africa. Waiting in reserve, training in near-total secrecy for an amphibious invasion of Malta that Axis High Command would ultimately cancel, was a 5,000-man Italian parachute division that had never fought a battle in its life. But they'd trained for 18 months, longer and harder than almost any other Italian formation in the war, for an operation that got scrapped before they ever boarded a transport plane. Instead, in the summer of 1942, they were handed rifles, mines, and Molotov cocktails and sent into the sand on the southern flank of the Alamein line, at the edge of a stretch of terrain called the Katara Depression. they were told to hold. But what happened to that division over the next 4 months would end with fewer than one man in 15 walking away. And it would become, even in British accounts written decades later by the men who defeated them, one of the most respected last stands of the entire North African War. Their name was the Folgore, October 23, November 4, 1942. El Alamein, Egypt. For General Bernard Montgomery opened the Second Battle of El Alamein on the night of October 23, 1942, with nearly 1,000 guns firing in coordinated barrages against a line that Rommel, recovering from illness in Germany when the offensive began, had left in the hands of General Georg Stumme. Stumme died of a heart attack on the second day of the battle, out checking the front lines himself. Rommel flew back and resumed command on October 25, but by then the arithmetic of the battle had already turned against him. Roughly 200 Allied tanks against around 500 Axis tanks, and an Eighth Army that had spent months rebuilding, while Rommel's supply lines across the Mediterranean were being strangled by Allied air and naval power. On the southern flank, dug into the sand, at the edge of the Katara Depression, the Folgore Parachute Division held a line facing the British 13th Corps. They had no armour of their own worth the name. What they had were rifles, a handful of anti-tank guns, 4 mines they'd laid by hand, and a supply of Molotov cocktails they'd learned to throw with enough accuracy to disable a tank's tracks at close range. British accounts written decades later, drawing on regimental histories from units that fought against them, describe Folgore paratroopers charging tanks on foot rather than falling back, not because they had a tactical advantage, but because the terrain and their orders gave them nowhere else to go. Of the roughly 5,000 Folgore soldiers committed to the Alamein line, only around 300 made it out. Historians differ on the exact figure, but every serious account agrees it's somewhere in that range. A division reduced to a fraction of its strength in a matter of days. Then, on November 3–4, the line broke entirely. In the north, the Italian Ariete Armoured Division, one of the better equipped Italian formations in the desert, was ordered to hold open a corridor for the retreating Axis forces, for it fought until it effectively ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Its own commander reporting back to Rommel's headquarters, in a message that made its way into multiple post-war accounts of the battle, that Ariete had sacrificed itself and no longer existed as a formation. German General Wilhelm von Thoma, commanding the Afrika Korps armour on the front line that same day, was captured by British forces after his tank was knocked out, becoming, in a detail that says something about how total the collapse was, a senior German general taken prisoner in direct violation of Hitler's own standing order, that his commanders were not to surrender. By the time the guns went quiet on November 4, 1942, the battle had cost the Axis and Allied forces combined something in the range of 9,000 German, 13,500 British and Commonwealth, and 17,000 Italian dead, wounded, and missing, figures that vary somewhat depending on the source and how casualties versus losses are counted, but that consistently place Italian losses at or above German losses in the final tally. And here is the part of this story that Italian veterans themselves, in post-war memoirs and oral histories, returned to again and again, not the fighting, but the retreat that followed it. As Rommel's forces pulled back west across Libya, transport was desperately scarce, and priority for the trucks and fuel that existed went overwhelmingly to German units. Multiple Italian formations, including remnants of infantry divisions that had held the line for months, were left to retreat on foot across open desert, with British armour closing in behind them. It's a detail confirmed by multiple historians, including in accounts specifically examining Axis coalition friction in North Africa. And it's the detail Italian soldiers who survived the campaign brought up most bitterly in the decades afterward. Not that the fighting had been hard, but that when the moment came to save the army, their ally saved its own men first. So if you're looking for a single clean answer to what Italian troops said after fighting alongside the Afrika Korps, the honest answer is that there isn't one. Some of them, especially the Bersaglieri, the Ariete crews and the Folgore paratroopers, earned a specific, hard-won respect from German soldiers who'd started the campaign, assuming they'd have to carry their ally through it. Others walked out of the desert on foot, watching German trucks drive past them, and came home with a very different kind of story to tell their families. One about being an ally whose sacrifice was accepted, but whose survival wasn't always someone else's priority. Both of those stories are true, Ford. Neither one cancels out the other. That's what makes this history worth telling accurately, instead of picking whichever version makes a better thumbnail. If you want the real, complicated version of this war, not the version where one side is simply brave and the other simply weak, this channel will keep digging it up. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and whether anyone in your family served in it. I read everyone, and it's often where the next story on this channel starts.